Welcome everyone. We're live on air. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. The Canadian Gift Association is committed to providing learning opportunities that help advance their members, exhibitors, and retailers. This afternoon's presentation is all about cybersecurity. We are thrilled to welcome Claudiu Popa, Certified Information Security and Privacy Professional and author of the Canadian Cyber Fraud Handbook, a professional reference. He will be answering questions throughout the presentation, so please use the Questions tab to communicate with him during the webinar. Claudiu, over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here today, and I hope everyone knows that they can contribute and they can get engaged with us while this is live. This is, of course, being recorded. It's going to be archived and available online, and of course we welcome comments online as well, but if you make them clear and crisp and live, I can address them as I'm speaking and as I'm powering through this presentation, which should take about 45 minutes, but it might go up to 60 depending on audience engagement. So thank you very much everyone for joining in, and we're going to be talking about data protection and how it relates to business strategy and how it relates to how you carry out your business going forward, because the cyber world has certainly changed in the past couple of years. It's hardly a day ever goes by without a notification, a newspaper article, a headline that talks about data breaches, and in most cases we don't know what to do about it. We don't know what to make of it. We see words, and language is a big deal, and that's why I want to make sure that we're using clear and crisp language today, because we see a lot of terminology that's being used both in the media and in everyday talk. We hear about ransomware, we hear about hacking of different types, malware infections, and so on, and it's important that everyone understand what this is all about, because things are changing so fast, and hopefully this presentation will still be relevant in the months and years to come, but just in case, do feel free to push through your questions as I'm making the presentation, because I certainly don't mind addressing questions and comments as we go along. So with that, we're gonna talk about some of those words that we just mentioned, and the fact that when we're talking about spear phishing, we all understand the same thing. So phishing, misspelled with a PH, simply means an email that someone receives that is designed to deceive them. So it's a deceptive email, and it's the spear part means that it's addressed to that individual directly. So you're not just getting an email that says, hey you, it actually says, hey Nicole, and your bank account is closing. So spear phishing, as you can imagine, is a lot more effective because it's targeted and it's individual, and it works a lot better than emails that are obviously fake, fraudulent, and generic. And by the way, those fake, fraudulent, and generic ones, you might not see a lot of them because anti-spam systems are able to intelligently filter them out. But in most cases, and if you're wondering why anti-spam technologies don't work so well with spear phishing, it's because the makers of those technologies simply can't take a chance to be seen as having cost a business an email that could have brought them business. So those are called false negatives. That means they are allowing an email to get past its defenses just in case. But in some cases, those are infected emails, and they get through, and it doesn't look good when the company gets compromised. And we read about data breaches in the mail, in the newspapers. So we also see on the screen talk of ransomware. What's ransomware? Well, it's a form of extortion, and that extortion occurs because somehow hackers got into a system, they locked up files that a business depends on, or even individuals depend on. And then they sat there for a while trying to figure out just how much this business is worth and how much individuals are worth, so that they can ask for the right amount. So that's the process that typically unfolds. Is someone clicks on a phishing email, they get their computer infected, that infection sometimes spreads across the whole company, and then at some point the hackers have finished copying all that data, they encrypt it, and then they pop up a message saying you need to pay us this much money to get it back. And that's an uncomfortable situation to be in, and we've seen this situation occur in particular in the news lately, because so many municipalities have been ransomed or extorted of late, simply because a lot of people are used to communicating by email, and they will almost instinctively click and open emails. And that certainly does happen, but there are technologies that that can stop these things, and that can certainly help. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. We're just going to power through a little bit faster, and some of the metrics we've been lacking in the past few years are now being made available in Canada, and we're now seeing the cost of Canadian data breaches soar. In some cases, it's this average of 6.03 million. In most cases, it's a lot lower, because as you can imagine, for small and mid-sized businesses, these costs don't approach the millions, otherwise they'd be out of business. But what this means is that the average cost being 6 million, you can imagine that some businesses are suffering costs in excess of 50 million. And in many cases, those are related to ransomware and to another trend that you may have heard of, which is called business email compromise, or CEO fraud. Those are the types of spear phishing that arrive in your inbox, and they ask you to urgently make a money transfer, and they impersonate your boss. So many large companies have made massive payments, in some cases upwards of $50 million, just as a result of a number of emails and sometimes phone calls. So you need to be aware of that terminology, business email compromises, because the RCMP has made it public that this is now a significant threat, and it exceeds ransomware in intensity. And the fact that we've got visibility into the Canadian picture of cybercrime is in part thanks to our reformed privacy legislation, which is our federal PIPEDA legislation, and it stands for Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. That's a mouthful, but it simply means that organizations that collect information are responsible for safeguarding that information and giving information subjects or information owners access to it. And individuals, customers in many cases, have the right to request that a company delete that data that they're holding about them. At least be able to inspect that information and correct it if need be. So as you can see by this map, the large metropolitan centers across Canada do see malware infections. These are, of course, just a fraction of the amount of infection that is actually taking place, because most organizations, most individuals do not report these. In fact, the government is saying that at best we see 5% of malicious attacks being reported. And that's too bad, but we have gotten conditioned to multiplying any of these numbers by 20 and getting closer to a real figure. So those metropolitan centers, of course, Toronto is right up there, and it leads the pack with technology adoption. And along with that technology adoption, we see a lot of these exposures and exploitations of vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities sometimes are at the user level, because employees are not adequately trained to not click on emails, to be suspicious. And sometimes they are due to the fact that information technology or or IT is not set up to filter some of these attacks and some of these attempts. So all this to say that it doesn't really matter what this graph says, except for the fact that there is criminal cybercrime, there's criminal activity going on in all of these major centers, and it makes sense for businesses of all sizes and in all sectors to be aware of the different types of flavors of these things. It makes a lot of sense to ensure that if you yourself understand what these things are, that you manage to find a way to communicate it to all your staff, to all your employees. And I often recommend that these companies also make it available to their third parties and their suppliers, their service providers. Everyone needs to be on the same page, because as I said, there's a discrepancy between the understanding of language. These technical terms that are finding their way into our language, into our everyday language, are often understood differently by different people. And so this graph that was made available, I want to say by a US source, and just as a general statement right now, I've done my best to quote and to mention where we get our data and our graphics and our sources, but I see that some of the slides don't necessarily have that information. If anyone wants to reach out and ask about that, I'll be happy to share it. And if your graphics have been inadvertently included, we apologize, and we're happy to remove them. But for the most part, this data is out there in the public domain. And as you can see, the United States have vastly higher numbers of breaches than every other country. Part of the reason for that is that they actually have cybersecurity legislation in place, whereas in Canada, as I said, we have mostly privacy legislation in place. That's part of the reason why you care about today's webinar, because it's about personal information, and personal information is protected by our federal law, by municipal laws, by provincial laws, and by sector laws in Canada. So we have a lot of privacy legislation, and the public, consumers, customers have recourse in what control they exercise over the information that businesses are storing about them. And one of the reasons for doing this is because data breaches are taking place so often that individuals and customers don't really know whether they have been subject to a data breach. So the privacy law has recently been reformed, and by recently I mean last November 2018, and now businesses of all sizes are required to report data breaches to victims and to the privacy commissioner, to the federal privacy commissioner. That's a big change, and that change has been coming for about 18 years. That change is something that consumers have been waiting for, simply because we haven't had a mechanism in place until now to request to essentially force businesses to report data breaches. Of course, that's a big deal, and the reason it's a big deal is that if you're going to be reporting breaches, you need to be able to detect them in the first place. We're seeing a lot of delays in the detection of these breaches. Sometimes it takes 240 days to detect a breach and another 40 days to eradicate the infection. And so the clear message here is that companies are not just required ethically to train themselves and their staff, but also to invest in technology. So as a cost center, certainly cybersecurity is not the cheapest, but it's the cost of doing business today, and that's not likely to go away anytime soon. When it comes to spam emails, one of the questions just came through. Would you recommend that people click on unsubscribe, or is it a ploy to validate one's email address? When when individuals receive a ridiculous amount of spam per day, it's usually an indication that you're on a spam list, and it's impossible to get off that spam list without actually changing your email address. You can probably tell the difference between the newsletters that you've signed up for and the spam that you have not signed up for. So there's a couple of flavors there, and the way you deal with that spam matters. The spam that you get from organizations that, let's say, you contacted at some point and they suddenly subscribed you to a list, those organizations, especially if they're Canadian, are absolutely required to unsubscribe you if you request it. The ones that are coming from complete strangers, I don't recommend clicking unsubscribe on, because you will be validating your existence, and it's easier to use a filter, an email filter, and mark it as spam and not see it again. So if you create a rule that will get rid of it, then you may be able to just avoid it that way. But just be careful as you're even opening them, because in many cases these emails are using things called web bugs. And a web bug is a tiny little image which is transparent and invisible, and it tells the originating server that some human being actually opened the email. Therefore, there's somebody there. So you'll be even more prominently located on that spam list. So how do we know that cyber criminals are only increasing their activities these days? And how do we know, in fact, that when we say that we need to report a data breach, that data breach is not just about the information that you may have lost access to, but it may also be about the information that that doesn't belong to you, right? So it's a matter of accountability, and that accountability is really where today's businesses really need to make a decision. That decision often has to do with thinking about all the scenarios. You start by understanding what type of information you are storing, and if you understand the level of sensitivity that you're responsible for, then you will understand the kind of information that an attacker will want to know about you. And that's what we're looking at here. So the cybercrime life cycle, which is actually called the kill chain, has to do with that initial definition of the target. First, they decide what it is that they want to attack. Then they will look for information on the target. Essentially, any business that they can find information on online, they will do that. They will look on LinkedIn. They'll figure out who reports to you or who you report to. They'll research that relationship. They'll figure out how much money your company makes. They'll create some kind of malware or buy some, and they will test for detection. Rest assured, no one actually sends out malware without determining that it will get past your antivirus. So that usually comes as a surprise to a lot of businesses today, because so many people say, well, I've got antivirus, so I'm okay. I want to say that yes, you are okay for the most part, but every once in a while, new malware, new malicious software gets introduced in the internet ecosystem, and on day one, or on day zero as it's called, these are called 0 days, naturally it's brand new, so no antivirus can detect it. So it's in their interest to launch it as quickly as possible. So as you look at the bottom of the graphic, you can pretty much anticipate that intrusion will take place without being detected. And once that happens, the software calls home, it strengthens its foothold, it establishes dominance on the system, and then it remains as quiet as it possibly can so that it can steal information or exfiltrate it for as long as possible. And we saw that a couple of years ago with the Sony breach, where attackers were still not sure who they were, but apparently they were state-sponsored. Attackers were in there for 9 to 10 months and stole hundreds of terabytes of information, including movies. That was supremely embarrassing to the organization. And of course, its stock price took a hit. So no one wants to be in that type of situation. And of course, this is why we care about prevention more so than reaction. On the previous point regarding the spam, when spam comes through, despite your having created a filter or a rule in your anti-spam, it means it's changing. And if it's changing, you need to create a broader rule, or you need to get a better tool for doing it. So one of the best anti-spam tools out there, again, this might be surprising to some, is Gmail. Gmail has a great anti-spam filter because it's learning from the entire deployed base of hundreds of millions, if not a billion people that it has as users. So when someone marks this as spam, that sender gets flagged as a spammer, but it also learns from the format of the email. So it learns from the structure of it, and with a very high degree of accuracy, it's able to filter that out. And the remaining risk is up to you. The remainder has to do with you creating filters that are appropriate. If you're targeted aggressively by spam and there's absolutely nothing you can do, then I would say that maybe it's time to change your email address and start over, because you're certainly never getting off a spam list. The best you can do is improve those filters. But as far as reporting breaches and the questions associated with reporting breaches, those have to do with the Privacy Commissioner, and we're going to talk about that real soon. What we're talking about now is the fact that there's an ecosystem for all this cyber crime. And as you can see from the screen, someone went and created it to look like a periodic table, just for fun. These are prices that are probably higher at this point. We're talking about millions of dollars in payouts for programmers who know how to break into practically anything. So they would go to one of these online marketplaces. In this case, the example is that of ZERODIUM. As I said, it sounds like a 0 day, and it is. So what they're looking for is to find a program that is not known by any antivirus, that will allow a criminal with deep pockets to buy these things right off of an online catalog and build them into their antivirus, into their malware, so that they can send it out as quickly as possible and take over as many computers as possible. So this is just to give you an idea of how organized this cybercrime really is, because a lot of people are making a career out of creating code, simple lines of programming code, that they then turn around and they sell to one of these marketplaces without actually attacking you with it. They're just literally programmers who are padding their income with this, and it's up to other people in this cybercrime ecosystem to monetize this further, all the way to the eventual exploitation of vulnerabilities that victimize businesses and individuals. So that's how it works. That's how complex and layered these things are. And of course, you start to wonder at that point that why is there physical crime at all? That's why this comic that's made the rounds for the past few years online is so apt, by John Klausner. It makes sense. Why don't people participate in the criminal ecosystem at some level, instead of actually lowering themselves and taking the riskier approach to still doing that old-fashioned, plain old crime and theft? And this is fundamental to what we're talking about today. The priorities of businesses, the priorities of anyone who talks about security, need to be aligned, and that always starts with this triangle. In fact, it's called the CIA triad for reasons that you can probably guess. The priorities being confidentiality, data integrity, and availability. What that means is that when you're putting in security controls and safeguards into place, you care about these three things. And you care about the confidentiality of information. Why? Because confidentiality allows you to realistically be able to protect the privacy of personal information for the data that you're collecting from a customer, for example. So you need to have confidentiality controls in place. What does that look like? Think of encryption. If you're scrambling the data, that's confidentiality. That's a safeguard that you have in place that covers and provides some level of assurance that you're protecting the personal information of customers and individuals. And that's what's being protected here by the law, by our Canadian privacy laws. Data integrity is at least as important as confidentiality. Data integrity means you're able to protect information to a degree where unauthorized individuals and unauthorized software or organizations cannot modify it. So only authorized parties are allowed to change information on file or on servers or whatnot. And encryption is also an example of this type of data. Why? Because if you encrypt a few files, let's say, and you change that file, and then you try to decrypt those original files, that encrypted archive, that container, will suddenly be corrupted. And that's a good way for you to find out if, let's say, you've had a virus infection and the file has been corrupted because some virus tried to modify it, or if someone tried to change a 0 to a 1. That's a way to protect the information inside the database. As you can imagine, that is critical to make sure that, especially if you're in a business that handles money or transactions, you want to make sure that you can trust those transactions. And finally, availability is the ability to have your systems running when they're expected to be running. So when you have a website, for example, when you're a bank or a retail store or an e-commerce site or a social media website, that website is useless. It doesn't matter how good it looks if users cannot access it. So that's another way that extortionists can get money out of their victims, by blocking access to their website, because time is money, and the longer those websites are blocked and the longer they are down, the more money they lose. So that's why attackers will want to ask for just the right amount of money to make it worth the while of the victims to pay rather than resist. So, of course, there are many types of information that are exposed in deliberate data breaches. And of course, we know about names and addresses, credit card numbers, and phone numbers. But nowadays, there's a lot more, and it goes beyond dates of birth. It goes beyond email addresses and even passwords. And what we're talking about is behavioral information. There's a lot of organizations that think of social media, think of the extent that they go to profile their users and understand the degree to which they care about buying white shirts or whatever kind of suitcases they prefer. The important thing is that they're able to monetize your behavior. So what you click on matters a lot, because their advertisers are paying them for access to your information. You are essentially the product. And that's a good rule of thumb to remember. Anytime you come across a website that's free and valuable and it's neat and useful, if in fact it comes to you at no charge, well, chances are you are the product. And when you've been victims of ransomware attacks, one thing that you need to keep in mind, and I don't see this enough in the media, is that there's a focus on the availability issue, that availability being the necessity of being able to access the information and the computer systems that are being blocked while you're being extorted. But so many businesses lose track of the fact that their information has actually been stolen. And in fact, it's gone. By the time the ransomware blocks your access to your data, rest assured they've had access to that data for a while. So that's why we consider ransomware to be included with data breaches. A data breach is effectively described very aptly by ransomware because it attacks not just the personal information that has been stolen, but it also attacks the business's ability to remain working, to remain in service. The best defense for ransomware and cyber extortion is education. Bar none, you need to be aware of what it looks like when a request comes in by email or even by phone. You need to be aware of the fact that there are websites that are infected, and in some cases those websites are not the most sketchy websites on the internet. Sometimes those websites are the most legitimate ones on the internet. We're talking about let's say news organizations, and as we know, there's a lot of news sites out there that have that are available for free, and the reason they're available for free is they have ads, they have banners across them. Well, those ads and banners are served up by a number of servers that are, there's a very small number of servers that serves up the majority of ads online. And if those servers can be infected, well, guess what? Those ads will infect the computer systems of people who visit the sites that the ads are on. So those are called watering hole attacks. They essentially infect a site and they wait for people to visit, they wait for people to click on things, and they wait for eyeballs. They don't come out to you, you go to them. And that's why it's called a watering hole attack. And if you've seen your documentaries, you know the kinds of animals that go there, and you can expect any kinds of systems to connect from mobile phones all the way to any platform that you can think of, from Apple iOS to Windows systems. So be careful with those. Awareness is the best defense against ransomware. Of course, you need to have backups. If you're going to back up your data, make sure that your backups are disconnected so that you're not infecting the backup. So when in many cases, companies do have backups. They're online backups. That means they're connected all the time. And sometimes they think that they can rely on their backups, and when they go to recover their data from backup and say that they will not pay ransoms, they are surprised to find that even their archived information has been infected. And by that time, it's often too late, because that information, the window during which attackers charge less money eventually expires, and I see all too many times businesses having to pay much higher prices than they otherwise would have. And that happened in, I believe it was Baltimore a couple of months ago, when the initial extortion amount was about $100,000, and the city decided to avoid paying, and they pushed it, and eventually it cost over $20 million to recover their operations. And a lot of that was productivity, a lot of that was systems and implementations, and of course, the public, citizens, were unable to get access to city and town services, right? They were trying to pay their bills, they were trying to pay all sorts of mortgage payments and so on. The question of spam and email-borne deceptive practices is one where you have to assume that you have been compromised, and then take preemptive steps to anticipate an email that will come to you in your inbox when you least expect it, and it'll ask for stuff. What will happen then? Well, you need to know that your antivirus is up to date, and you need to know that if you do have any sort of sensitive information on your computer, that you know exactly how old that backup is, right? So make sure that your backups are are in fact disconnected in between the times when you do your backups. But if you really can't get off those spam lists, then you need to stop using those emails. One way to stop using them is to literally disconnect them from your inbox, to literally stop using the account. There's a number of websites, I want to say there's about 2 or 3, that will allow you to close any account. So if it's not clear to you how to close, let's say, a Gmail account or a Facebook account or what have you, there's a website out there. You can do a search for this, and there's a website out there that has hundreds of sites, and they have a number of buttons on it, and the name escapes me right now, but you can easily Google it, where it will allow you to close any website, and it'll tell you what the relative complexity of doing so is, because going on and keeping on receiving spam eventually will expose you to some sort of a data breach, and those data breaches will liberate some information that has value either to you or to other people, and you could potentially be embarrassed by these breaches. And in fact, many small businesses in the past year have gone out of business as a result of the severity of data breaches. So some of those data breaches really end up hurting the public, and the way they do that is because that stolen information is either immediately being put to use by, let's say, by being submitted as benefits fraud, identity theft of all kinds, stealing or opening accounts in your name with the utilities or phone companies. Bank fraud's a big one, and the banks are starting to no longer accept just any excuse for getting defrauded. There's a lot of pushback, especially in Canada, that we're seeing by banks, and they're increasingly saying, well, it's likely that it was your fault for not being able to protect your information adequately. And they didn't used to do that. They used to cover just about any situation. So it's important to understand that these types of breaches, all of which are preventable, do have an economic impact, not just on the business, but also on the individuals affected. So this is the type of ransomware screen that you're likely to see. Actually, this is one of the oldest ones that that started the trend of ransomware, the crypto locker one, and that's what it looked like. It said you have a certain amount of time left to pay however many dollars you have to pay. Nowadays, of course, they ask for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is extremely difficult to get without compromising your privacy. You have to go online and set yourself up with an account and transfer money into a sketchy website, oftentimes to, again, have your identity information compromised while you're struggling to complete a transaction to satisfy these criminals. But here's a slide that gives you as a business an idea of the kinds of things that you can do to protect yourself against the impact of ransomware. And of course, backing up makes sense because you just want to be able to revert back to a time when you were not infected. And that's possible. In some cases, it's even advisable. But in other cases, it's a risk to say, you know what, I'm going to take my time and recover from backup when you know that backup might have been infected to begin with. So you do have to have technical detection capabilities in place, and a lot of today's anti-malware, antivirus suites do have that built in. Just make sure before you buy it, make sure you look for the word ransomware protection. You do need to understand the law, especially privacy laws in Canada. For larger companies, we do recommend tabletop exercises because companies do need to know how to react to these things. And by that, we mean, how does a whole team, the IT support team, for example, how do they anticipate these things and how will they react if it happens? Because it's likely to be extremely stressful, as it was for Sony a few years ago when they They went to work and everyone's computer had a skull on it. So that was certainly an extended period of time. I think it was about a month that it took them to recover, and during that month they had to go back to pencils and paper. Train your first responders. All of these developing crisis management plans and so on are in fact for large companies. They do need to have these in place, and it makes sense because when you have a lot of employees, you may have a weak link somewhere in your workforce. But here's what I wanted to talk about. At the bottom, it says get insurance. It's important to realize that nowadays, you're not just getting flood insurance or car insurance. Businesses seek out and get cyber liability insurance. And before you call your broker, you need to make sure that you know what you're going to ask them. One of the things you need to ask them is whether you're covered for phishing, for business email compromises, and for ransomware. And if they say, well, you're not covered if you're the one who clicked on it, then you need to go to the next company, because you can't afford to have a false sense of security about this. Right? It's very important that you understand what the exclusions are going to be, because not all policies are created the same. And we'll talk about some of the other aspects as we make our way through these slides. So thank you for your questions so far. Really appreciate it. I'm going to try to power through a lot of these slides just so we're not making this a 6-hour presentation. But the slide that you see here is obviously the Trojan horse, which is an implication that in many cases users themselves impact their own company's security by clicking on things, by opening files, by going to websites that are infected, or even pick up USBs from the parking lot and go back to their workstation and insert them into their computer. And how does ransomware and data theft work? Well, it's as simple as this comic. That initial breach is where people climb your firewall. A firewall is essentially just that. It's a filter that tries to detect attacks. In some cases, it can't. And attackers or cyber criminals will make their way past that and follow all of those cyclical steps that we talked about earlier with the circular slide. We see that there's a time of not just minutes and hours, but we're talking about months when it comes to recovering from these types of data breaches. And sometimes they start very, very simply with emails like these ones. You've got a package waiting for you. Click here to track it. Click here to accept the package. Organizations are having their identities borrowed for these types of phishing emails. And of course, people see Purelator or Canada Post or UPS, and they trust that these come from a legitimate source. But in fact, it's very, very easy, as you can probably imagine, to steal someone's, or to just copy a logo and to send out a few emails that look legit. So be aware that if you receive an email that sounds urgent, it likely isn't. And if it asks you to click on things, think twice before doing that. Of course, we have to acknowledge the fact that sometimes data breaches occur internally. There's the matter of employee theft. There are accidental breaches as well as intentional breaches. So it's not just about hackers. It's also about the infections that come through vendors and subcontractors. We saw that with retailers in the US. We saw that with Target, where the breach ostensibly came through an HVAC or a third-party provider that happened to be infected, and it infected the whole company. So sometimes you can do all the right things, and it's the companies that you are connected to that will compromise your security and that of your customers. I like this question. Can webinar launchers be malicious malware? Absolutely. I think that the risk is too great to continue with this webinar, so you better hang up now. But in all seriousness, anything can be malware. And that's a good point, because in some cases people expect malware to be some useless piece of software, when in fact there's the practice of creating actually useful programs that have some infection associated with them is growing. And we see a lot of people getting infected online these days when they're looking for, let's say, a converter from MP3 to MP4 or some other kind of format, or a PDF reader or a PDF writer, or some tool to copy videos off of YouTube. Things like that may even work, and you'll still get infected. Now there's no guarantee that they're infected, but you should be able to deal with the cognitive dissonance that comes with believing that something that's infected will be uniquely malicious. It can be a working program and still infect you. So keep that in mind as we talk about the top trend, which is cyber risk liability insurance. It's certainly growing in Canada by leaps and bounds. My recommendation earlier still stands. You need to be able to interview the people who are selling you these policies, and you need to get assurance that these policies will cover you if it comes to that, because you can't afford to have a false sense of security. You need to know exactly the kind of scenarios that you're covered for and what you're not covered for. So cybercrimes are not just intentional, well-planned attacks. Sometimes they're cybercrimes of opportunity, and they just come about because your systems are misconfigured. And your systems, of course, anything that connects to the internet is visible from outside. You can see all these things just the same way that you can see Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi of your neighbors as you're looking for a way to get on the internet. So be aware of the fact that user error is just as much of a culprit in data compromises as intentional breaches are. And of course, there's a lot of talk about vulnerable code, and people wonder why are there so many operating system updates that will fix some obscure security vulnerability. Well, there's no code that has no vulnerabilities. So, and there's no code that's 100% secure. So as soon as you get those notifications about security updates, you need to make sure that you understand the importance of applying them as soon as possible, even if they are business systems. If it's a critical update, it means that if you choose to not apply it right away, you are accepting the risk. And if you're accepting the risk that comes with not securing your systems, then that insurance company might in fact say that they will not cover you because you made the decision to accept the risk. Therefore, you choose to not transfer it to the insurance company. I'm going to be powering through a couple of the next few slides, and I hope that this is not going to be too fast, because I'll just be telling you what these are. So just for fun, I have this this slide with the 10 immutable laws of security, and you can read these at your leisure. It's actually a tongue-in-cheek slide, but it's very much applicable, and it's real. So do have a look and pause the video if you need to. One important site that I need to bring to your attention is Have I Been Pwned? And Have I Been Pwned is spelled just like that. So do spell it like that and add the .com, go there, enter your email address, and figure out just how many breaches your email address has been part of. Some of those breaches will include passwords, and that'll give you an idea of why you might have ended up on spam lists, and it'll give you the reminder that you need to handle your passwords as strictly and as carefully as possible. And by that I mean you should not use your password on more than one site or one device ever at a time. So all your passwords need to be unique. And as such, you need to have some sort of a system to store them all, a system that you trust. On this slide, I give you two examples. One is called KeePass, K-E-E-P-A-S-S, and that is a program that runs on your phone or your computer. And the other one is called LastPass. and that runs in the cloud. You decide, but do check them out and try to use them. They're extremely useful, and they're pretty much the only way for you to avoid reusing your password on more than one site. Because if you do, if that one site gets breached, the attackers will take your password from there and use it to try to get into your accounts on a number of other sites. That's called credential stuffing, and that's how hacking works. More importantly, if you have the option to use two-factor authentication, do so. Ensure that anytime you create a new account or a new banking application that you're installing, make sure you ask for two-factor to be enabled. Sometimes it's called two-step verification, as it is with Gmail, but always look for a second factor, because that'll increase your security. So we talked about this. There are 4 ways to treat risk. If you're choosing not to apply security patches, then you're accepting that risk. Otherwise, you are transferring it to the insurance company, and that's a good way to do it. Mitigation strategies include applying antivirus and having firewalls, and certainly avoidance is the best way. If you decide that the risk is too great, then you're going to need to not do something. So if something comes with a high risk penalty, then risk avoidance is your best bet. Legislation will allow you to, so legislation works in the interest of many, many businesses. In Canada, we have CASL, Canada's anti-spam law, and it ensures that businesses don't pester people with unauthorized requests for buying and promotional offers and so on, and that's where you need to be aware of the terminology CEM. So look for CEMs, commercial electronic messages, and inform yourself about CASL, because in some cases, if it is a legitimate business that is spamming you, you can report them. And you can report them right here to the CRTC in Canada, or there's actually a particular website address that I'm happy to share with you if you'll send emails later or just write in the comments. But CASL may very well apply to you, and these slides will determine whether you need to worry about it or not. But chances are you do. Earlier today or earlier yesterday, I talked about California's new privacy law. That's a big deal because it's actually stronger in many ways than our own privacy legislation here in Canada. It's a big deal because suddenly large organizations will be required to answer to individuals. And in many cases, they have ways to enforce payments and fines if these types of legislation, privacy legislation, are being ignored or are being negligently applied. And that's why the CCPA, this new legislation in California, is called a light version of GDPR, Europe's privacy legislation, which of course is scaring so many people, so many businesses around the world, because it applies in so many jurisdictions. So just powering along here, and sorry about the speed that we're going at, but we need to wrap up soon, and the focus becomes on breaches, because that's what our federal privacy law now requests. Many organizations do care about breaches, and so they've put procedures in place to anticipate and defuse data breaches, but the vast majority of small and mid-sized businesses do not today have procedures in place to deal with them. That's a big deal, because SMEs, small and mid-sized enterprises, do need to invest in their ability to detect data breaches so that they can report them to the Privacy Commissioner and to the victims themselves. That reporting is important because it needs to take place in hours or days and no longer in weeks or months, as we've seen for so many years. In fact, a lot of organizations have treated breach notification as an optional task, and And now we need to align ourselves as to the meaning of breach of security safeguard. So I've copied it here from the Digital Privacy Act, which augments our federal privacy law, and it means a breach of security safeguards, as you can see here. But here's the kicker. The risk is defined as something that causes significant harm. And there's many different types of significant harm, but again, these need to agree across the board. So taking a general approach, and certainly an approach that prioritizes the feelings of customers or anticipates the feeling of customers, is the right way to go when you're embracing breach notification. So here are some practical strategies that you can review. You can certainly try to prevent a breach as much as possible, but do try to contain it as much as possible and be transparent. You need to be able to respond and recover, remediate, report, and review. So do make sure that you have policies in place that are enforced. Ask about Canada's voluntary new cybersecurity framework. Check your cyber liability policy, and do get one if you don't have one. Check out, have I been pwned? Train your staff and verify your security every year if you're in business and if you touch any kind of personal information. So as a gift or a perk, do download these complimentary ebooks. They were created by our previous privacy commissioner in Ontario. Feel free to access those short links. The real links are really long, so I shortened them for you here with my own short link. You can trust it. And let me know how you like them. Thank you very much for connecting today, and I'll pass the baton back to Nicole.
Thank you so much for an informative presentation. Wow, what an expert. A recording of this webinar will be available on the CanGift website under the Learn tab within 24 hours. You can also follow Claudiu on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn for more information. Our next webinar is coming up on October 3rd, and you can join us to learn about merchandising for the holiday season with our very special guest, Canadian designer Corey Christopher. We'll be releasing more information about our next webinars tomorrow, so you can visit our website, cangift.org, for that information and to sign up. Thank you again for attending today.